afternoon, everyone. My name is Scott Sheads. I've been with the National Park Service for 40 years. I retired about 2 years ago, and I spend most of my time doing research, tending to my little garden, and giving lectures at various sites, which I hope I know a little something about to enlighten people about different sites' history. And this site down here has always been in the back of my mind. So what I thought I would like to do today is tell you about the importance of this site. Then we'll also talk about the flag. I was fortunate enough to be one of the 2 historians assigned to the flag by the Park Service to the Smithsonian, and my job is to do the research on the original flag that you may see today in Washington, D.C. But before we talk about the flag, and there's been some new discoveries, new reinterpretations of the flag, and how about Francis Scott Key. I'll share that with you today. But this is sacred ground that we're on. The Battle of North Point. Well, Battle of North Point is not the correct term. North Point is that way. The battlefield is 5 miles that way. It should be called the Battle of Patapsco Neck. But in all military campaigns, there's always a beginning and there's always an end. And that's what makes this site, Todd's Inheritance, on the National Register of Historic Places by the Park Service, that's what makes this place special, in my view. The British landed here, the campaign began here, and the British came back through here, ending the campaign of the Battle of Baltimore. And the Todd family had a very important part in that story. But the story of the Battle of Patapsco Neck and the Star-Spangled Banner, it begins a whole year earlier. Soon after the war was declared in June of 1812, England was still fighting Napoleon. And so it wasn't until 1813, with Napoleon now defeated from his retreat from Moscow, which pretty much put him away, England now could focus their full attention on America. And in this little war in America and in the Napoleonic campaigns. So what happens now in the summer of 1814, the British now, with Napoleon temporarily out of the way, put in motion what would be the final campaign of the War of 1812, and this is the War on the Chesapeake Bay, the middle ground of the War of 1812. In August of 1814, 50 British warships sailed up the Chesapeake Bay. The alarm soon spread. Church bells were ringing the church bells all along the Chesapeake. Express riders were riding along the Chesapeake Bay shores, alarming the citizens that the British are on their way. The British marched on Washington, a 50-mile march, defeated the American army twice their size, entered the nation's capital, and burned it. The Americans did the most damage. We can give the British maybe 5 buildings that they actually burned. The other 100 and some buildings were all burned by the retreating Americans to prevent their capture from the British Army, which I could never quite understand. But we set fire to the American Navy Yard and other buildings to prevent their capture. But the fire was so intense on the night of August the 24th that the soldiers at Fort McHenry, citizens on Federal Hill in downtown Baltimore, could look toward the southwest horizon and see the glow of Washington burning on the horizon. And everyone knew Baltimore would be next. And we knew this a year before, because Baltimore is the 3rd largest city in the country, population of 50,000, 10,000 of which were free African Americans, the largest free African American population in the country. It remained so up through the Civil War. So Baltimore is a multicultural city. Just about every European country is represented by the citizens of Baltimore. And that's what makes it fascinating for me as a historian. So what happens now in the summer of 1813, as Baltimore begins preparations, they survey this entire peninsula, 10-mile long peninsula. They note on a map, which we have on display in here, where every farm is, where every road is, where every creek is, what's a defensible position. And all that is mapped out well in advance. They sent out a corps of observation. This is something that was done in the Revolutionary War. A group of cavalry or infantry or artillery, and they would come down here almost weekly throughout the 1813 and into 1814, setting up observation posts all along the shorelines to keep a lookout for British barges that may attempt to land. And here, Todd's Inheritance was the headquarters of that corps of observation. And Bernard Todd, who was a member of the local militia cavalry, his job was stationed here. And from the top of the house, he had a clear view of the middle Chesapeake Bay. And so on September the 11th, 1814, the British fleet of 50 warships came up the Chesapeake Bay, and the alarm was set. Bernard Todd got on his horse and galloped down the road here to alarm the citizens of Baltimore that the British Navy has arrived off the shoreline of North Point. And the Battle for Baltimore campaign begins. Some 4,500 British troops will land at North Point and begin their 10-mile march towards Baltimore, and they marched right by this house towards the city. Now, we all know about the Battle of North Point. The Battle of Patapsco Neck took place about 6 miles north of here. The Americans were pushed back all the way to what is today Patterson Park, where 15,000 Americans, Delawareans, Pennsylvanians, Virginians, Marines, Navy, and 42 pieces of artillery lined the crest of what we know today as Patterson Park, defending the city from the land invasion by the British Army. The next day, September the 13th, British warships start sailing up the Patapsco River to begin their commencement of the bombardment of Fort McHenry. So for 25 straight hours, the British bombarded the fort. The plan here for the British Army, they only have one plan, Plan A. It's got the army now, the British Army, poised where Bayview Hospital is today, barely a mile away from Patterson Park, then known as Hampstead Hill. The plan here is this. The British ships will come up below Fort McHenry, commence a naval bombardment, destroy the water batteries there, push through the defenses of Fort McHenry and the Lazaretto, and get into position just around Fells Point and begin a naval bombardment of the American defenses in the city itself, and the British would make a frontal and flank attack against nearly 15,000 Americans up on a high ridge. But the British are unsuccessful in taking Fort McHenry. And so in the early morning hours of September the 14th, after 25 hours of intense bombardment, the British horse sailed and sailed away. During the entire battle, there were 1,800 British mortar shells fired at the fort. A British bomb shell is like the atom bomb of its day. It's the most destructive force on earth. 200 pounds of exploding hot metal would be fired from a bomb ship 2 miles below Fort McHenry. That would send the whole ship, because of the recoil of the mortar, would send the whole ship upwards of a foot into the water. The shell would rise 1 mile up into the sky. It's not there now, but it used to be. And begin its downward descent, and in 27 seconds later, it would be bursting its shell over the ramparts of Fort McHenry. So during the battle, there were severe thunderstorms, lightning flashed across the sky, rain just pouring down in torrents. There are accounts of the grounds actually moving from the concussion of the artillery. It was awful. I wasn't there, but these two gentlemen were. And so throughout the stormy night of the battle, the Baltimore campaign was coming to a close. And this is where we get to the story of this flag. Perhaps the most famous flag in American history, with the exception of perhaps the flag that flew over Iwo Jima in World War II. Right after the British left Washington to go back to Benedict to get back on their ships to make the attack here in Baltimore, they arrested a very prominent doctor. His name was Dr. William Beans, a very 65-year-old former Scotsman. He's very well known. One of his patients happened to be Francis Scott Key and of some friends. The British took Dr. Beans prisoner on their way back from Washington to their ships because Dr. Beans and some of the local townfolk had arrested some of the British stragglers straggling behind the British army. One of those British prisoners escaped the town jail at Upper Marlborough and sent word to the British commander, Major General Robert Ross. Ross thought this was a breach of faith because he had just had dinner and spent the night at Dr. Beans' house. And he seemed to be an all right guy. But as soon as the British left, he and some town folks arrested 4 of those British soldiers. He took that as a breach of faith. So he arrested Dr. Beans, brought him to Benedict, and put him on a British warship. Word is sent to Washington about the capture of Dr. Beans, and they got the best lawyer they could find. Francis Scott Key out of Georgetown, Maryland, argued cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. Key came to Baltimore to obtain the assistance of Colonel John Skinner. He is with the American Prisoner of War Exchange Agent. He's the key guy here, not Key. John Skinner, Stuart Skinner, is the key guy in all this Star-Spangled Banner business. He is the one who knows the British Navy officer. He's the one that's making the exchange of correspondence between London and Washington. He's the in-between man. So Skinner is very well versed in the diplomacy. Key is only there because he's got letters from wounded British officers who have written about the kind assistance they will be given by American doctors on the fields of Bladensburg. The Admiral makes the decision to attack Baltimore. They sail up the river, and Key is transferred from a British warship to an American flag of truce vessel. A little 100 vessel, much like the Pride of Baltimore, same size. Has a crew of 8 members. It's a flag of truce vessel, flying a white flag underneath the American flag. And Key is only detained, and Dr. Beans is only detained on a small American vessel to watch the bombardment. He's only 3 miles away. And from that vantage point, he watches the battle. It's not until the next morning, the British, having been defeated on their attempts to take Baltimore by land and sea, withdraw. And it's at that moment that Key sees the flag. Not the big flag that we see today in Washington, D.C. There were 2 flags at Fort McHenry. Every fort pretty much had 2 flags. A storm flag, just about the size of this one we see here, but a much bigger flag called a garrison flag, which this flag would cover just the blue one. And so during the stormy night, it was not, the big flag was not up. It was the small storm flag that was flying over the ramparts during the stormy night. The next morning, the American gun batteries fell silent at 4:30. At 7:30, the British stopped the bombardment, and at 9 o'clock, by looking through the British logbooks, the British hoisted their sails, turned the ships around, and sailed away. The battle for Baltimore is over. This is when Key sees the flag. The battle smoke has drifted away now. He can see the flag. It's at that moment that the small flag was taken down. And it's at that moment at 9 a.m., 3 hours after the battle is over, they raised that big garrison flag we see today at the Smithsonian in Washington. And it's at that moment he sees the flag. There are more legends and lore about this flag and even the battle itself. But my job is to find those stories and find out whether they were true or false. The story that's been told for over 100 years is Major Armistead had that flag made, and he hoisted that flag up because his wife, who he had sent to Gettysburg for safety, had given birth to their daughter, Georgiana. Well, no, that's not right. That flag was raised, and the Americans got themselves on top of the walls, and you know how guys are. A victory! Well, no. Another story is they had the flag raised up high so Key could see it, so he could write the national anthem. Well, no, that's not right. Well, why did they raise the flag? Well, hello. There's a very simple explanation for it. Army regulations state at 9 o'clock every morning, you change the old guard that had been guarding the fort during the night and replace it with the new guard. 4 young musicians, these are 15, 16-year-old boys, fifes and drums, came out on the parade ground with the big flag, the garrison flag. They fired the morning gun, and it's at that moment at 9 o'clock, they raised the big flag, just as the British were sailing away. Well, now there's a correlation. The British sailed away because the Americans have hoisted the flag. So the big flag was not up during the battle. It was put up 3 hours after the battle, and that's when Key actually saw it. The British come back down here, the North Point. The British Army marches right by here. They get back on their ships, and 2 days later, they set sail down the Potomac River, down the Chesapeake Bay. The next objective will be New Orleans, which will be the last major battle of the War of 1812. So what happens to Key here? Well, he's still on an American flag of truce vessel. I pointed out that Skinner is the key guy in all this business, because if the Americans had surrendered, Admiral Cochrane, the commander-in-chief, had an official agent of the U.S. government right by his side to negotiate terms of discussion, terms of surrender. So Skinner is the key guy. But all of a sudden now, we forget about him because Key, being a former member, a devout member of the Episcopal faith, comes up with this idea for a new song. He's written a lot of songs. Even today, in most church hymnals, you'll find hymns written by Francis Scott Key, very religious man. And he wrote down these 4 verses. The British let him go. He sails right past Fort McHenry. He never visits Fort McHenry in his entire lifetime. There's no reason for him to visit Fort McHenry. There's nothing special about the place. He sails into Fells Point, spends the night, and the next morning he shows the song to a friend of his. His friend takes it to a local printer, and within 3 days, it is published in a handbill to the tune of "To Anacreon in Heaven," a very popular melody back then. It was written in London in 1780. Key used that melody on several occasions, but now here's another occasion to write it for. And so copies were distributed throughout the city. 1,000 copies were given to the soldiers at Fort McHenry. By Christmas, it had gone to the top of the charts. Number 1. It replaced Yankee Doodle as the new national song. It went viral. By Christmas of 1814, there were not 1, 2, but I found 3, and Ed, you would appreciate this, 3 brand new liquid refreshment stands in Fells Point known as the Star-Spangled Banner Tavern. Oh, it swept the country. By January of 1815, every newspaper in the country had published the song. It swept the nation. It gave Key immortalization of the Star-Spangled Banner. It won't become the official national anthem until 1931, although it had been used as our national song for well over a half a century before that. In 1933, Fort McHenry was transferred from the War Department to the National Park Service. And it's at that moment that we have Defenders Day, which has been celebrated here for over 100 years, starts to fade away. Some of us remember the old Defenders Day parades. These were big affairs in the 40s and 50s and 60s. That begins to fade away now as Fort McHenry, Francis Scott Key, and the Star-Spangled Banner now rises to the forefront, whereas the Battle of Patapsco Neck falls to the rear of us. Story. But the real story of the Battle of Baltimore is what is fought on this landscape. This is what the citizens of Baltimore fought for. Their farms. These are known as market farms. Not uncommon for a farm here like the Joneses or the Todds to have 1,000 acres of cherry trees or apple trees or peach trees. These are huge market farms. And so what had concerned me a great deal in recent years is the story of the Battle of Patapsco Neck. It hasn't gotten the recognition it should receive. Fort McHenry gets all the attention mainly because of the fireworks display, the National Anthem. But the real story of the Battle for Baltimore begins here at Todd's Inheritance, where it began and the campaign ended. So I am working on a new, something I've been working on for a couple of years, it's almost finished, is a book tentatively entitled Sacred Ground, the Battle for Patapsco Neck. New discoveries and reinterpretations of some of these stories that we've heard for years, but not exactly correct. And it just takes a lot of research to find these. What impresses me a lot is the role of the women in the War of 1812 here in Baltimore. Don't hear any story about that, but their stories are there. What has always intrigued me, I'm not much on battlefields and cannons and things, but what intrigues me about big events is not the central event that we all remember, but the people who are on the peripheral. Without these people, people like the Todds, you would not have these big stories take place. And those are the stories I'm aiming for, to find really the background story of the Star-Spangled Banner. So the flag here we have before us is 15 stars and 15 stripes, and this was the official flag of the United States from 1795 until 1818. And in this time period, whenever a state was admitted to the Union, they not only had a star, but also a stripe to the flag. And this is why the Fort McHenry flag, the Star-Spangled Banner, has 15 stripes. Vermont and Kentucky are the bottom two. You all listening to me? Okay, good, good. However, by 1812, when we declared war on England, and rightly so, there were actually 18 states. Tennessee, Ohio, and Louisiana had all been admitted by 1812, but for whatever reason, Congress never got around to adding those 3 extra states to the flag, because they're busy. So although we have 15 stars and stripes, there are actually 18 states. So after the war now, as the country now begins moving west, across the Alleghenies and down the Ohio, every citizen soldier, every federal soldier who served in the War of 1812 could receive upwards of 340 acres of free bounty land. Land given to you instead of cash. And that land would be yours, what is now would be the Indiana and Ohio and Michigan territories. So in the years after the War of 1812, especially in the 1850s, you'll see a big surge westward for that land. And now I may make something perfectly clear here. That land bounty is no longer given out. So as the people begin moving west, more states come in. And as more states come in, the flag is going to get bigger. And that is why, my friends and neighbors, we have Congress to figure this stuff out. So in 1818, Congress adopts the 13-striped flag we have today for the 13 original states. So from 1818 until today, whenever a new state, such as the case of Alaska, 1959, Hawaii, 1960, are admitted to the Union, the first flag is flown at Fort McHenry 1 minute after midnight before it's flown anywhere else in the world. So hopefully, as we look towards the future, maybe next month, when the eastern shore of Maryland breaks off and forms the 51st state in the Union, that first flag will be flown at Fort McHenry. And leave those poor people alone over there. The flag remained in the Armistead family after the battle. It's government property. Doesn't belong to the Armistead family, but he takes care of it. He dies in 1818, and it's given to his wife, Louisa. And it's in her hands until 1861. And while that flag travels through the history of America, Mrs. Armistead receives requests from family and friends for a snippet of the flag, about the size of your fist. And one of my jobs at the Smithsonian was to track down these pieces of the flag. There is 6 feet missing from the fly end of the flag. It's not due to the battle, because the flag was not put up until after the battle. It's due to the Armistead family. Louisa had a pretty big pair of scissors, and she cut pieces of it off and distributed it to friends. And it was my job and the historian at the Smithsonian to track down all those pieces. And we found most of them. And some of them have been given back to the Smithsonian. So that's what's happened to a large portion of the flag, is for souvenirs given out. And so finally in 1907, the flag was in pretty poor shape, and so the descendants of Major George Armistead, the commander of the fort, gave it to the Smithsonian with the stipulation that it would never, never be removed, and the Smithsonian kept their promise, except for one event, and that was World War II, when it was kept in Luray Caverns, as most of the precious objects in Washington were stored at in secret. And then it's been brought back to the Smithsonian. So if you go to the Smithsonian today, you can see the original flag. There's a wonderful website that the Smithsonian has on the preservation techniques of it. And when one of my visits down during the restoration, I was there that one day, one of the seamstresses found a needle in the flag from when the flag was last mended soon after the battle. So there's a lot of interesting stories about the flag itself, and so I suggest you go into the website and look a little bit more about them. So I've enjoyed my little visit here. This is one of my favorite sites because it is so peaceful down here. I live in Locust Point, the land of Under Armour, but it's always a pleasure for me to come down here because there's stories here that need to be told. That are not really being told on the bookshelves of America. And so if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them for you. So have a nice day, folks. Have a nice day. And since we have enough folks here, I have bought a copy of the original. No, it could be the original flag. No, I bought a copy of the flag we fly at Fort McHenry. It's a full-size replica of it. So what I thought would be a nice idea is to get the flag out, and hopefully we get a picture taken from the window there and have all of you around the flag. So this would take about 5 minutes to get the flag out. So let's do that.